Hey everybody, welcome back to Off the Wall. I'm Mike. Yeah, I'm getting over being sick. That's why this review is coming out so late. So thank you for everyone who is still watching it. I know a couple days later doesn't seem like much, especially because right now, at the time I'm recording this, Star Wars Celebration's going on. We're planning on doing a big Star Wars Celebration recap once it's all over with. We got trailer reactions coming at some point later on. A lot of stuff going on right now. I've been sick. Boggs has been out of town and traveling and doing family stuff. Soul's been working. We've been busy. So here I am with what little voice I have today from being to talk about The Mandalorian. Now, I know this episode has been incredibly divisive for a lot of people. Boggs, in particular, hated this episode. A lot of people hated this episode. And I get where they're coming from. I enjoyed it for what it was. I'm not going to sit here and act like it was the best episode of The Mandalorian. I actually do think it, in the grand scheme of episodes released so far, it is probably my least favorite. I did get some enjoyment out of it for what it was, and that's kind of what this review is going to be about. The episode focuses mainly on Bo-Katan and Din and Grogu going to this planet, Plazir 15, that is currently ruled by a duke and a duchess played by Lizzo and her husband, Captain, who's played by Jack Black, which won't lie, had me kind of squealing a little bit. And we also get to see Christopher Lloyd is here as the commissioner of this kind of almost utopian society, as it were. And we get to see how this world has kind of flourished under its little dome since the fall of the Empire and the rise of the New Republic. The episode's very kind of like hard-boiled detective buddy cop type story. There's an investigation. And they're trying to they're tracking down clues and they're gathering intel. The episode's called Guns for Hire, and it is very much a Guns for Hire episode in more ways than one. The episode I think it's fun in a silly, goofy kind of way that kind of reminded me a lot of like the Clone Wars and Rebels. It had a very much that kind of feel to the writing and the style and the directing. We see separatist battle droids come back with the familiar voice actors who did the voices of the droids in the animated series. And that's kind of where I think this is kind of losing people. Is this episode felt very um, almost kid and family friendly in the way that the Clone Wars and Rebels were. It wasn't that the episode was bad by any stretch of the imagination, but it was a little bit of it was very much a step down from what we've come to expect from the Mandalorian as a whole. And I think this episode is a big part of what a lot of folks have felt about this season is that it's been a little bit disjointed, that we haven't held as tight to the overall story as they would have normally liked. Um, they're using this season to do some kind of world building. We know there was a lot of like Mandalorian and Star Wars like spin-offs that were in production, a lot of which kind of due to COVID and other reasons and got the axe, and it felt like some of the ideas they were wanting to do with those spin-off shows got exercised a little bit in this season. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, but I do get why some people who are used to the Mandalorian being very self-contained can have some frustrations with that. Although I do think we got a little bit more character work with this than I think folks are giving it credit for. At this point, we know that it seems to be that the end goal of this season is to do with Bo-Katan trying to retake her spot as ruler of Mandalore and bring the Mandalorians back together. The idea that Mandalorians are stronger together and we're far too spread out across the galaxy and divided right now, especially when it comes to their ideals between those who walked away, like Din Djarin in the covert, and people like Bo-Katan and her brother. And she's now she's been deemed the one to bring everyone together again. They're going to retake Mandalore. And I think that through this episode where we had Bo and Din running this investigation for the captain and the Duchess, I feel like we actually got to see a lot about these two characters in the idea of where am I going with this? So Bo Katan wants to lead Mandalore, and we've shown that when it comes to diplomacy and problem solving, she's better at that kind of thing than Din. Din's more good at when it calls for aggressive negotiations, to borrow a term from my least favorite Star Wars movie. Um, that's more Din's specialty. And I think what we saw in this episode was a clear sign that sometimes the situation calls for one or the other. And while Bo is more seems to be more suited for the diplomacy side of things and the sort of careful, methodical approach, Din's more like, no, let's go in guns blazing and just nip this thing in the butt. And it showed, I think, what's going to come in later as some character point is they both have those gaps. And so I think what I'm predicting we're going to see happen is Bo is going to ask Din to either lead and rule alongside her or be like her top dog in running Mandalore, ask him to step away from being the bounty hunter and help her but rule and lead Mandalore, rule and lead the Mandalorians to be that, so that they can kind of complement each other in that way. We see a lot of those moments happen in this episode. And so that's why I think this episode isn't getting as much credit as it deserves, because I do think that we're seeing that there was some very clever character work in this episode, but it wasn't the overt character work that I think we're used to seeing. Again, I don't think this episode was bad by any stretch of the imagination. I still think it was a pretty good episode, but it was definitely my least favorite of The Mandalorian up to this point. I'm not ready to call it filler episode just yet because we haven't seen the end of this story. And by the end, I mean the end of season 3. It's really hard for me to get on board with the idea of saying an episode doesn't mean anything as far as the plot goes when we don't know the whole plot. There's still more story to be told here. You know, you can look back at the very first episode of The Mandalorian where he's hanging out with Ugnaught Kree. You could easily say, like, oh, what does this have to do with anything? It's just an Ugnaught, he's learning to ride a thing, who cares? That comes back later at the end of the season. So, you know, even the first time that we see Bo Katan in season 2 of The Mandalorian, oh, cool cameo. We're never going to see her again. She comes back at the end. So it's too soon, I think, to start writing off episodes or plot elements or whatever you want to call it as filler or not meaning anything when we don't know how the story's going to end yet. Which also I think does play into the other criticism people are having, which is the idea of like they don't feel like they know where the story is going. I think it's abundantly clear where the story is going. I think it's going to be the Mandalorian. It's going to be Bo-Katan trying to regain the trust of the Mandalorian people so they can retake Mandalore. Ultimately, I don't think that the end of that this season's main character has been Din Djarin. If anything, he's been kind of the audience's through line for this season, which I think people aren't used to. But you also remember the show is called The Mandalorian, not Din Djarin, not Space Daddy Pedro. Like, it's called The Mandalorian. Ultimately, it's about Mandalorians in general. It's always been that way. The Mandalorian lore and the culture and, you know, reclaiming what was once lost for them. That's always, ever since season 2, ever since Moff Gideon and the Darksaber were introduced in season 1, honestly. So that I think stands to reason that it's far too early to say that anything is filler or doesn't matter, because there's still more story to tell. And I'm just talking about this season. I'm not saying we need to wait till the end of the show to say whether or not it was filler. That's asking too much. But as far as this season goes, there's still 2 episodes left. There's still more story to learn. And so I'm not ready to write this episode off just yet. I will say it was a little bit of a bummer because Bryce Dallas Howard, up till this point, has directed some of the best Star Wars television that I think we've seen, whether it was her episodes of The Mandalorian or Book of Boba Fett, or even her episode of Tales of the Jedi, which was stellar. This definitely, I think, is the weakest of the episodes that she's worked on. However, um, I'm not, I'm not the kind of person who, like, I see one trip or one misstep and I'm like, up, no, that's not how I roll. Like there mistakes happen. Mistakes happen. Not everything's going to be perfect. And yeah, you want it to be. You expect it to be. Our expectations of, because we've had such high quality Star Wars television up until now, are very high. And I think that's deserved. The same with comic book movies. Whenever we see a comic book movie that doesn't, like, absolutely knock it out of the park, our initial reaction is to write it off because we're so used to things like The Dark Knight, The Batman, Captain America, Winter Soldier, Infinity War. We're so, Shang-Chi, we're so used to these movies that are absolutely mwah. So whenever we get something that's less than that, we feel like, oh, well, nah. And I don't like that attitude. You can look at it and say, I didn't like that one as much, but to sit there and say, well, this one wasn't as good as I wanted it to be, because I've seen this a lot on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram of like, oh, this one wasn't as good as I wanted it to be. I guess The Mandalorian's done. Star Wars sucks. No, they lost it. They lost it. No, they had an episode that wasn't as good. Tough shit, So I like this one for what it was. It was fun. But it was, when I talk about, which is a weird word nowadays, fun has almost become a pejorative term, to borrow from this episode. Because I feel like once people say something is fun, everyone immediately goes, oh, well, it's not that good then. No, a movie can be fun and still be good. Moana is a lot of fun. It's also a very good movie. So when I say that something is fun, I don't mean that it was bad. It was more focused on making me laugh and making me go, ooh, than maybe telling a story. It wasn't a story driven episode, but it was character driven. It was spectacle driven. And at the end of the day, like, gotta remember, Star Wars started out as an indie spectacle film. Like, the first Star Wars movie wasn't like this super methodical, extremely clever, plot centric. It was a fun movie about a farm boy who went to fight, who joined the good fight against the bad guys with the space wizard. Like that, I don't say that to me is disrespectful. I love Star Wars. I love Star Wars, but that's how Star Wars started out. And people talk all the time about how the Clone Wars and the Rebels are so good, despite being family friendly and fun. And they say, oh, they want, people to take those things seriously. Well, this was very much a Clone Wars Rebels type episode. This is the kind of thing we would see in a Clone Wars or Rebels episode. And so you kind of can't have it both ways. Like, this is the kind of thing that you want people to get on board with when you say, oh, give Clone Wars a chance, give Rebels a chance. Well, give this a chance. Don't just write it off because it's not what you wanted, which is what I've seen a lot of people doing. Now, again, everyone's entitled to their opinions. And like again, Bogz did not like this episode at all. And that's fine. He doesn't have to like it. But Bogz is also a smart enough person to know that you don't write off the entire show because you didn't like one episode. One of my favorite shows for the longest time was Arrow. And I have no problem saying that, like, there are episodes of that show that just were not good. Granted, I haven't watched it in a long time, and I know everything's pretty much done. But favorite movies, favorite shows. Batman's my favorite character. Batman and Robin sucks. that's a no brainer. But that doesn't mean I write off Batman. It just means I just don't watch that movie. So when I ultimately come back to rewatching season 3 of The Mandalorian, I'll probably skip this episode because it doesn't, as far as we know to this point, contribute a whole lot to the overall story. But it is what it is. This was a popcorn episode. This was a sit down with your kids and see some funny cameos and just kind of don't be so serious. Because remember, we just had 9 episodes of Andor that were all very serious, very dramatic storytelling. This and The Mandalorian, for the most part, has been that as well. It's been a little bit more fun with it, but ultimately it's been much more serious storytelling. this was a time for them to say, let's just have fun with these characters. Let's have an action figure episode where you've got your Bo-Katan action figure and your Din action figure, and oh yeah, they're gonna go. We're gonna have them go and help out these guys, and we're gonna stop some battle droids came out. This was a fun pretend episode, and there's something about that that I just find endearing and enjoyable. So I'm glad that um, I'm glad that we took the time to have some fun. Ultimately, I do understand people's frustrations with the episode, but I think that a lot of folks are being a little too quick to just write the show off or write the episode off as having no substance to it because of this one. I think there's actually a lot more to this episode under the surface as far as the character work goes, like I mentioned earlier, that I think folks are giving it credit for. I do think if this episode had come out much earlier in the season, it would have been received differently. If this was like episode 2 or 3, I think people would have been a little bit more accepting of it. I think what really hurts this episode is the fact that we are episode 6 of 8 with this one. We're close enough to the end that this is not really the time for a story deviation like this. Like this is seems like something we kind of maybe should have had something this fun earlier in the season. That being said, there are still 2 episodes left. You can do a lot in 2 episodes. These episodes aren't particularly the longest thing ever, but they have shown that through this season, especially, we can tell a lot of story in a short amount of time. Because the Mandalorian doesn't like to waste time, and I realize I'm saying that given the episode that we're talking about, but the show as a whole um, tends to just do the thing. And we've got 2 more episodes where they can just do the thing. I will say this episode does start to bring up some of those fears I tend to have when it comes to Disney Plus television, which is when it comes to season finales, they don't always stick the landing. Sometimes they leave a little bit too much undone by the season finale, and then we're in a rush to wrap everything up. Even with shows that I love, Ms. Marvel, I loved it, had that problem with the finale. Moon Knight, loved it, had that problem with the finale. So I hope that Mandalorian has not had that problem in the first 2 seasons, but I am starting to feel some of that familiarity as far as storytelling goes with these Disney Plus series, where it's like, okay, but we're running out of time. There's still time left, but we are running out of time. We'll see how I feel after next week's episode, considering it'll be the penultimate one. So, a lot of feelings, a lot of emotions about this episode. Ultimately, I did enjoy it for what it was, but it was far from my favorite. It's probably still my least favorite episode, but I think there was more to it than people are giving it credit for. I want to know what you guys think, so make sure you let me know down in the comments. Like and subscribe, hit that all notification bell, all that good stuff. We'll see you guys again here next time on Off the Wall.